Okay, now that we've got a rough picture of what the biological perspective on death is all about, why Degrassi thinks maybe that's a good way to think, and we've got a rough idea of the methodology. Again, Degrassi is going to try to undermine the persons-based perspective. Let's look at a couple of arguments for why the persons-based perspective is supposed to support a higher brain standard of death. Uh, there are basically two variations here. The first one is referred to as the essentialist argument. And it goes basically like this. So first it says that the capacity for consciousness is essential to persons. Notice there that this is going to be grounded in the person-based perspective, because what we're doing is we're not asking, what is common to all instances of death, which is what the biological perspective does. Instead, what we're doing is starting with this certain facts about persons. And when we say persons here, we're not just talking about human beings. We're talking about sort of fully developed agents. We're talking about adults with no sort of serious mental or memory deficits or anything like that. They have the capacity for rationality, a sense of themselves over time, things like that. Um, and so the first premise of this argument just says, look, what is essential or fundamental to being a person is the capacity for consciousness. We don't know of anything that counts as a person that doesn't have consciousness. The idea here is just that personhood is a set of capacities. It's a set of things that you're able to do that non-persons can't do. It's arguably what sort of distinguishes humans from non-human animals, is their capacity for personhood, although that's more of a spectrum than sort of a sharp divide. And the idea is just that, look, in order to have all those capacities and qualities, you have to be a conscious being. And non-human animals, many of them have consciousness, we think, but they don't necessarily count as persons because they can't do some of the other things. All right, so that gives us premise two. Therefore, any being who lacks or loses this capacity is not a person, because the idea there is just that consciousness is sort of what we would call a necessary condition for personhood. If you don't have consciousness, you can't have any of the other stuff either. So if you lack your capacity for consciousness or lose it permanently, you can no longer be a person because you no longer have the other features that make you a person. That gives us premise three. Therefore, when someone loses this capacity permanently, there ceases to be a person associated with their physical body. That in turn gives us the conclusion. Therefore, when someone permanently loses the capacity for consciousness, they are dead. Notice there that what's going on is premise three is sort of, again, appealing to the persons-based view. And what's sort of in the background here is this idea that, look, when you lose personhood, you're dead. That's kind of the essence of the persons-based perspective on death. It's like whatever it takes for personhood, when that's gone, you're dead. And this argument is just pointing out, look, what's really fundamental to personhood is consciousness. So when you don't have that, that's when you're dead. And that's going to support the higher brain standard simply because consciousness, we think, is a product of the prefrontal cortex, which is what's usually referred to as the higher brain. This is sort of neocortex and prefrontal cortex activity. It's not brainstem and kind of lower brain type of activity. And so that's kind of how we get from claims about persons to the higher brain standard of death, is through this appeal to the capacity for consciousness is more or less essential for personhood, and personhood as the key to whether you are alive or not. Okay, so that's kind of a factual descriptive argument, but there's also a value-based alternative. Now this argument is it's not so much arguing, and we'll look at this as a problem for this argument shortly. It's not so much arguing that the higher brain standard is correct, but just that it's the right way to think. Given the things that we care about, we ought to adopt it. So not for sort of descriptive accuracy reasons, but for evaluative reasons. So here's how this argument goes. It says that humans value consciousness as necessary to living a meaningful existence. Probably that's true for most of us. That's one of the sort of puzzles about folks who want to claim that people in persistent vegetative states still live valuable lives. It's sort of difficult to understand, like, in what sense that's true. And you'll notice that in those, when controversies come up about those cases, Terri Schiavo's, again, the sort of example everyone's familiar with, the debate is not usually about why non-conscious life is valuable. Usually what people are trying to do is show that those people have some level of consciousness. That seems to imply that we think consciousness is important for living a meaningful existence. Well, if that's true, then it means that when we permanently lose the capacity for consciousness, what we lose is the possibility of a meaningful existence. And the thought here is, look, once we lose the possibility of meaningful existence, we may as well think of ourselves as dead, because for all sort of reasons that matter to us, we actually are dead. The thought here is, look, a meaningless life is effectively no life at all. Now, this sort of strikes at what a lot of people seem to think about persistent vegetative states. But again, notice that it's not, and it's sort of emphasized there with the highlighting, it's not, the argument here is not, look, this is actually correct. The essentialist view is arguing that, look, the person-based perspective is the right way to think about this. It implies the higher brain standard, so people in persistent vegetative states really are dead. This argument is not like that. It's saying, no, it's just, there are good sort of value-based reasons why we ought to think of these people as dead. They're not actually dead. It's just that we should think of them that way. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate, what we have going on here is these two competing methodologies for how to define death. The biological approach is consistent with the two standards we've already looked at, but not the higher brain standard. And the higher brain standard uniquely follows from the person-based perspective, and these arguments give you a sense of how that's supposed to be true. So now the further question that deGrazi is going to focus on is which methodology we ought to adopt. He thinks that, by figuring that out, we'll be able to determine whether the higher brain standard ought to be on the table. So if the person-based perspective is out, the higher brain standard gets thrown out with it. And what deGrazi is going to try to show, and what we're going to look at in the next couple of clips here, is that the person-based perspective has a number of just unacceptable implications, things that seem crazy. And on the basis of those crazy implications, we ought to reject it as the right methodology for developing a definition of death. And then in turn, since the higher brain standard depends on that methodology, we should reject the higher brain standard as well. So again, just reiterating, this is how this goes. We're going to move in just a minute to some of these problems that are supposed to undermine the person-based perspective. Go ahead and take care of the question. It's about the essentialist argument. It's basically just testing whether you're understanding its main point. It's going to ask you to sort of pick it out from a series of sentences that may or may not sort of capture what it's all about. So go ahead and complete that, and then we'll conclude with our last two clips looking at some problems for the person-based perspective.